Okay, perhaps because my part is just about housekeeping, maybe we can kick off with a welcome from me. My name is Tibet Kara. I'm the Secretary General at British Chamber of Commerce. We have a great webinar topic today, and we are organizing this webinar jointly with the Reputation and Ethics Society, and we have our members and UK companies presenting on a very interesting topic, and I'm sure it will be very interesting for you. I just want to give you some housekeeping for the webinar. This webinar will be recorded and it will be uploaded to our website. So you can watch it if you miss some part of it later on. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the speakers session. Please write down your questions during any time to the question and answer part of the buttons you will see. Without further ado, I will pass the floor to Fikret Bey, who is the Managing Director of Cerebra, who's also our member and also board member of the Reputational and Ethics Society. We also have our member company BP presenting, and Linklaters law firm today. And it's going to be about failure to prevent fraud offense. The topic is very interesting, and it's a big culture change in the UK, and how this is going to be put in practice. We're going to listen and learn. So over to you, Fikret Bey. Thank you very much for everyone joining. Have a good webinar.
Thank you very much, Tibet Hanım. As you said, the name is quite interesting, failure to prevent fraud. So we'll see. Hello, everyone, and welcome, and thanks for joining us. My name is Fikret Sebilcioğlu. I'm a board member of Ethics and Reputation Society and the founder and CEO of Cerebra Forensic and Integrity. By profession, I'm a forensic accountant and fraud investigator. I'm very pleased today to be here because my firm, Cerebra, is a corporate member of two associations, TEİD and BCCT. So I really do feel at home in this community. Today's session is called From Compliance to Culture, the UK's new failure to prevent fraud regime. As Tibet Hanım stated, it's a joint event organized by TEİD and BCCT, and I'll be moderating this discussion. The UK failure to prevent a fraud offense came into force on 1st of September 2025, so it's quite recent. Therefore, I'm really excited myself to hear about what's going on this aspect and how it's going to impact Turkey as well. So we'll be looking at this offense, why it matters, how it is starting. I'm saying starting because it's quite recent, starting to reshape the way organizations think about fraud risk and corporate accountability. Yes, this is a UK offense, but it's definitely not a UK issue. It matters here in Turkey too, especially for UK companies operating in Turkey and any organizations having connection with UK. And just to be clear at the outset, I'm not going to pretend that I know this offense and its implication. If I did, believe or not, this session will be wrapped up in 5 minutes. But luckily, I'm joined today by highly experienced speakers who can bring a conceptual framework and its practical insight. So my job today will be to ask right questions and to keep this conversation moving. Let's turn to our panelists. Please give us a quick introduction, your name, your role, your firm, and maybe just one sentence on why this topic matters to you. And then we are going to dive into the discussions. Shall we start with you, Ellie?
Sure, thank you, Fikret, and yeah, very happy to have been invited to speak today. So my name's Ellie Proudlock. I am a criminal defence lawyer by background. I've been at Linklaters for about 8 years, and I'm a partner in the investigations practice. And I advise companies on the whole range of financial crime, including fraud, but also bribery, etc. And, because my role is defending companies in criminal investigations and advising them on how to prevent being in one, this new offence has been a very significant development of the sort that we know from 15 years ago with the Bribery Act coming into force.
So I wonder how you are going to defend your clients as far as failure to fraud is concerned. So we'll talk about this. Thank you very much, Johannes.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much for having us here as Linklaters team. I'm closely collaborating with Ellie on various topics regarding compliance. I'm not with Linklaters since 8 years. I'm with Linklaters since 8 months, a bit more. But 15 years I was on your side of the audience table. I was in-house counsel, chief compliance officer in various companies, and I was always working on the interface between really the legal expertise on the one side and on the other side, how to put it into organizational processes, how to put it into practice. And so I'm very much looking forward to the discussions we have today.
Thank you, Johannes. Thank you very much. And Arzu.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can see me well. And I'm really, really excited to be here and to meet all of you, even virtually. My name is Arzu. I'm the Ethics and Compliance Liaison for 2 regions at VP, AGT first one, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Turkey, and North Sea. And I also support data privacy across our production and operation businesses. But I started my career as an external auditor. Partly, I become from a family of finance professionals. Later, I moved into finance and commercial roles at BP before finding my, I think, passion in ethics and compliance. So I love finance. I think that background taught me a lot about risk and the importance of building a strong culture. And today's conversation, I think, about failure to prevent fraud offense and also culture and trust and integrity. It's so important, especially as we all operate in a complex and fast changing in a global world. I'm thrilled to be joined by valuable professionals today. I cannot say I'm an expert as well, but I'll be sharing my experience. And thank you for moderating the session, Ikret. I look forward to this lively discussion.
That's my pleasure, Arzu. Thank you very much. Okay, let's start. First question to Ellie. To start with the basics. What does the failure to prevent fraud offense introduce, and why does it matter for organizations? Could you please also mention what kind of fraud risks we are talking about under this offense when you are sharing your thoughts?
Sure. So without getting sort of too deep into the legalities, the offence, as you said, introduced last September. It applies only to corporates, so not to directors or any other individuals, and only to large organisations, which is a concept that we'll come on to. And basically, it's committed by a large organisation where a person who is associated with that organisation commits a UK fraud for the organisation's benefit. And so that raises the question, what's an associated person? It's very broadly defined. So it includes all employees, all agents, all subsidiary undertakings, and also any other person that performs services for or on behalf of the organisation. So it's effectively designed to capture a whole really sort of wide range of third-party relationships. But importantly, and this is something that Johannes will come on to speak about in much more detail, organisations can protect themselves from criminal liability because there's a full defence if the company can show that at the relevant time of the fraud being committed, it had reasonable anti-fraud procedures in place. So basically, this offence it's a formula that we've seen before with failure to prevent bribery offence under the Bribery Act, which many people listening may be familiar with because that also has very broad extraterritorial scope. But it does have some key differences. So, and this answers your question about why it's important for organisations, for example, in Turkey. It doesn't matter where the organisation is incorporated or where it carries on a business. So it applies to all large organizations around the world where the underlying fraud that's committed has a UK nexus. And so it really can capture a large number of companies very far out of the UK. And in terms of then which fraud risks are relevant, I think one of the other key differences from the Bribery Act is that rather than there just being one underlying offence, there are a number. So fraud, as Johannes will come on to describe in more detail when he's talking about the controls, it can be committed in so many different ways, right? So to call out just a few of the fraud offences that are in scope: fraud by false representation, fraud by abuse of position, false accounting, cheating the public revenue, and also aiding and abetting any of those offences. And all I would add is that an important, and this may be a word of kind of reassurance, I guess, an important feature of all of those offences is that they require dishonesty and intent. And so they're not offences that can be committed by accident or even negligently by being bad at your job. They require a criminal mind. And so that has to be proven at the kind of base level at the UK fraud. And then after that, it doesn't matter whether the organisation knew about it or not. If they failed to prevent it, they don't have the reasonable procedures, they can be criminally liable. And that's what we're talking about today.
Right. Thank you. So you just talked about reasonable fraud prevention procedures. So I'm a bit familiar with reasonable assurance terminology when I was an external auditor. So it's always a little bit difficult to understand. When I read the guidance of failure to prevent fraud offense, it says that organizations will have a defense if they have reasonable procedures in place to prevent fraud. So the question to Johannes, in simple terms, what do reasonable fraud prevention procedures look like in practice, and how will organizations show these procedures are actually working? Because we can say that, okay, we've got reasonable procedures, but how we are going to prove that they are working effectively?
Yeah, absolutely. So based on my experience in various companies when I was in compliance roles, I think first step is really to run a respective risk assessment to really evaluate how exposed is my business. And that is the first change in what you always do normally in the compliance management framework. You have different, and Ellie pointed to it, there might be a variety of new people who might be in the need for trainings and who might be considered in the risk assessment. So it starts from the tax department going to the sales department, but also in other areas, procurement, logistics. There are a lot of different possibilities to commit fraud. And on the one side, what is a requirement is dishonesty, as Ellie pointed out. So it needs to be absolutely trained in the respective training materials, but at the end, I think it's a new scope. It's a new risk group that you have to look at, and proportionate and reasonable means that you do not have to overdo it, but you need to have a good feeling. You need to have a control over what happens. So you see the risk, and then you have to implement a respective control. And the question whether it's effective or not is a very tricky one, because there were in the past, there were similarities in the antitrust area where regulators always said if the compliance management framework did not prevent everything, one infringement of the laws, then it was not effective, because this is the evidence that it's hard evidence it failed. The compliance management system or framework failed. And I think that's nothing that we can expect from such a compliance framework here for the fraud prevention. But you need to have a good understanding of the risks, and then you from time to time you have to do spot checks. You have to look into the key risk areas, to talk with the people who have the highest risk exposure, whether they really understand the topic. And then we come to the normal other preventive measures that you have to have in place. And it starts with the tone from the top, I think, without setting the right tone at the top and at the middle management to ensure, and this is also the headline of this webinar, to ensure that that is not only followed by the letters of the laws and by the letters of the respective internal policies, but it's really a mindset that you want to be on the safe side, you do not want to infringe laws, and that this is that the board and also the middle management sets the right tone and is really the Rolex perfect, setting the right examples for respective measures.
Goodness, I always find quite difficult in Turkey, at least, to explain my clients or potential clients the importance of the fraud risk management.
Yeah.
And actually, in my opinion, this reasonable fraud prevention procedures are 100% related to fraud risk management, because you should identify your risks and then you have to work on this risk if your existing controls are working properly. If they are not working properly, then you are going to design new controls and you are going
Right.
to and this is one point. And the other one, if I can convince them that this is important, still they find it quite difficult how they are going to identify their fraud risks in the processes. Just very briefly, could you please share your thoughts on this, how they can manage this, how they can identify their fraud risk? When I'm saying fraud, of course, bribery, kickback, financial statement fraud, asset misappropriation, all of them.
I think it's very important to start from the top, but not to end at the top, but go down to the people who are really on the front line, discussing the matters with their clients, with third parties, etc., what their businesses that they are doing. So it's important to really go down the ladder from talking to the hierarchy, but then also to people who are really exposed to these daily risk situations. And what turned out to be very effective is really thinking in scenarios, thinking in ideas, what could go wrong, and then have a discussion with the respective people. But I think it's very important that you do not think only of a checklist, that you go to a meeting with a checklist and say yes or no, yes or no, yes or no, but to facilitate an open dialogue about that, to explain the topic, to explain really what are we talking about. And Ellie will talk about that later in more detail again, I think, really on what are really the key situations where fraud can happen. And it's, as Ellie already pointed out, it's a variety of topics. And you just bring these bullets to the meeting and say, these are my talking points. I have this scenario or that scenario. And then the people should start thinking, your interview partners should start thinking about, well, this is not absolutely identical with my situation, but I see a similarity here, parallels here. And then you have a dialogue. So it's very important that you have this analysis done by someone who understands the law, but also understands the business on the other side and can speak in terms of your particular business.
I heard the words that I want to hear, Johannes, from you. Open dialogue.
Open dialogue. Yeah.
Open dialogue is the critical words. I don't know why, but most of the time it's quite difficult to establish open dialogue in companies. I think this is related to the, of course, tone at the top. Tone at the top should facilitate this habit, culture, whatever you call it. But if we can start talking about fraud risks openly, then I think it's an excellent start.
Absolutely.
Okay. When I read the guidance of this offense, I came across many times the word culture. Actually, I'm used to hear this word in FCPA as well, the UK Bribery Act, but I think something is different here. I don't think I still did understand quite well, because also the offense is new and also it's not enforced for a long time. We'll see, of course, what's going to happen. But as a fraud investigator, I'm quite interested in this culture issue. And also I understood that it's extremely difficult or extremely easy to change. It's somewhere in the middle to change culture. But most of the time it takes time. And my understanding is the key feature of the failure to prevent fraud offense is that it affects corporate culture as much as it does compliance. Because when we hear offense, okay, it's compliance, it's law, it's compliance, but it's trying to change something in the company as far as culture is concerned. So my question to Arzu, do you think this offense will genuinely drive a cultural shift and it will push organization to implement or strengthen their fraud prevention procedures? If so, how it's going to happen?
I think it's an excellent question, Fikret. Thank you. I think it will help to help companies to shift their cultures, and I think a real anti-fraud culture is one where ethical decisions actually decision making actually survives the commercial pressure. So it's not about, I think, posters, it's not about slogans, it's not about annual reminders, but I think it's about lived behaviors. And one of the strongest indicator for this is the leadership that who are actually role modeling the ethical behavior. Sorry, as Joanna's also mentioned. So people actually watch for leaders far more than they read procedures. So they notice whether leaders are acting transparently, whether they're admitting their mistakes, whether they pause or they stop transactions when they see red flags, or whether they accept delays or lost revenues because of integrity concerns. So when I think leaders do these things, they send a powerful message about what truly matters. And fraud risk drops, and culture, I think, improves in such situations. I think that's why we often talk about the tone from the top, but equally, I think equally important thing is the tone in the middle, right? So leaders need to intervene and stop poor behaviors as well. And when we say leaders, we are not only just talking about the senior leaders, we talk about the first level and mid-level leaders as well. Another indicator for a genuine or real culture, anti-fraud culture, might be, I think, psychological safety. So a safe environment where people can speak up. So when people are afraid to raise concerns or maybe ask questions, I think small issues turn into big risks, into like a snowball. So in a real anti-fraud culture, I think people feel safe asking questions, and when they do, they know they will be listened to. So they are not punished for asking questions, or maybe sometimes it can be as challenging assumptions or challenging decisions. So they trust the process and they trust the speak up channels are working. And in such cultures, I think concerns come up very quickly, so long before they turn into fraud cases. Another indicator for a real culture, anti-fraud culture, which might be linked to speak up, by the way. It's, I think, fair and consistent investigations with no exception based on seniority, performance, I don't know, revenue generations. So a strong culture cannot coexist, I think, with the selective enforcement. So we should never appear to favor high performers or leaders. So, and the employees, I think, regarding the investigations, they do not need the details about the cases, but they do need confidence that outcomes are fair and unbiased and applied actually equally across all the organization. And lastly, something I really like to remind the business that I'm working in, that I'm supporting: fraud, failure to prevent fraud, or any other E&C risk does not solely sit with compliance. So business leaders actually owns fraud risk in their operations. Finance owns the integrity of reporting, I don't know, representation, and procurement own the third-party risks. So compliance are there, we are supporting, we're challenging, we're advising, but we do not replace the accountability. Hope this answers your question.
Definitely, but I think the time will show us how the enforcement will show if it's this offense will going to impact the culture or not. But most of the time, honestly, when I'm talking about ethics in any conversation, I don't like referring to laws or offenses.
Right.
Ethics is something inside. If you push people to something because of law or offense, I don't like this way. And but although this offense is a part of law, of course, but I think it's my understanding, or at least that's something maybe I want to hear. It's a bit how to say, positive approach from the lawmaker to the companies, that this is important. This is not something we cannot confine fraud to one perpetrator, one bad actor. And if there's a problem, this problem should be sorted out in the company with the leadership. I think this offense is just trying to touch the DNA of the company in this respect. That's why I'm really interested in. And also, I read somewhere, especially about the culture issue. It says that this offense asks not whether a policy existed,
Yes,
but
absolutely.
whether it was understood, implemented, monitored. I mean, we all know these words in the UK BA or FCPA, but last one, capable of influencing behavior across the organization. I like these words, capable of influencing behavior across the organization. So as a company, if we have a problem in the court, we have to show that our policies, procedures are capable of influencing behavior across the organization. This is difficult, but I think that's something we should keep in our mind. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
And by the way, when we look at the historical major fraud cases like, I don't know, Wirecard or Enron, so I think most of the organizations already had those policies, right? So they had anti-financial crime policies, they had internal controls, maybe including segregation of duties. Some had board oversight. But the issue, as you mentioned, was really about the absence of the policies, the issue about how it was applied, how it was interpreted, and sometimes how it was bypassed by the leaders.
Exactly. Yeah. That's one of the most favorite issue in our fraud investigations: segregation of duties, circumvention of the controls. Okay, that's great. Thank you very much.
If I may add to that, Fikret and Azu, I think it's
I was going to come to you actually, Johannes, but go ahead, please.
Azu, what you said, I think it's absolutely right that culture is much more than only the policies. I think you can have, in former times, I think the compliance management framework consisted primarily of checking all the elements that you have, and then you implement it, and then you thought you are off the hook in every case. And I think that's important, and as you said, Fikret, I think a very important shift from this approach also from regulators to say, no, I'm supporting. If you try to establish a compliance culture, then you should get some benefits for that. We are supporting that, and that is something I've seen that in various other legal areas. It's in anti-corruption. We see the new EU anti-corruption policy in Europe, in the EU, coming up in the next years, and they also stress the importance of compliance in general, and they also say in that compliance that is only window dressing. They really refer to that in the arguments for this new regulation. They simply say if it's compliance just for window dressing, it might be to the detriment of the parties, because they really want to support only real compliance. And with regard to how you can evidence, I think one of where I made some very good experiences was to have in these annual HR surveys that you will have normally, that you manage to get not the whole survey about compliance, but if they talk about everything else, that this is also part of this global HR survey that you run in your companies to see what value does compliance have in the relationship with your direct supervisors. Can you support your supervisor? Do you feel, as Azu said, do I feel comfortable to speak up and to be heard? And it's something where you can raise issues without that someone says, oh, you're stupid and don't ask these questions, just do it. So this is really a complete shift in the culture. And I think it's at the very end, such a culture is not blocking the business. I think that's absolutely important. That's not blocking the business, because if you have such a culture, it's also helping for all the business decision that you say, I didn't understand that. I have to execute this order, but the customer is not paying. I don't know where it is. So this is a culture of enabling people to think on their own, to not follow only policies, but really to think about topics and to raise a hand because they are entrepreneurs on their own. And I think that's really a shift that can help the whole company, not only with regard to the compliance topics. Sorry, I wanted to add that from my perspective.
Contribution. Please do it whenever you have any questions. Other panelists, if you have an issue, please get in the discussion. Johannes, I just want to continue with you. Very briefly, I want to look at this offense from the perspective of the board responsibility, senior management responsibility. Do you think it's going to change something in the boardroom? It's going to change their responsibility?
Well, I think it's there are several other triggers as well, that there is a shift in the board oversight. In Germany, you have different laws now asking really public listed companies to have a audit committee in the supervisory board, that they have to look into it. They need to have not only a look at the policies and on the paperwork, but they need to speak to people. They need to speak to the experts for risk and compliance. So there are other elements as well triggering that change. But I think since this fraud risk is really broad and can pop up everywhere and has an impact, also I think a positive impact, that you can rest assured at the very end that your accounting documents are appropriate, that the tax declarations are all in good shape, and that these risks are eliminated by also taking this fraud risk into perspective. So I think, yes, it will change the involvement of the boards, be it supervisory board, be it the executive board, or different setups. And I think if you, I don't think that there is any micromanagement required for that. It's really that what we just talked about, this culture is supported, that the board functions really ask for data, for instance, like the HR survey, that they want to understand, is it something that people perceive as a support, or is it something that people perceive within the company as a threat? And if the people come back and say, well, it's more a support, the compliance is trying to solve, and we didn't know that this could be an issue and that could be an issue, then it's really teamwork, and that is really helpful. And I think this is something that the board can identify without going into every detail, into every discussion that compliance or the management has with others.
I think boards or senior management should find a way, effective way, to trace fraud risks and how they are responded in the company. They should find a way. I don't know, but when I read the guidance of failure to prevent fraud offense, I understand. I mean, if there is any problem at the board level, board will not be able to say that I don't know. I mean,
no, absolutely.
At some stage, I read this sentence: ignorance is no longer a defense. I love it. This is great. Yeah. I think we should weigh as advisors as well to explain our clients and board.
Yeah.
Okay, this is the situation. You should find a way. Okay, I totally agree that micromanagement is a problem, of course, but at certain level, they should find a way to address this issue.
Yeah, I think in that context, I think two things. The first is that, of course, the board needs to give the instructions to the compliance teams or whoever is in charge of that to identify the respective risks. And if there is a chance to align it with existing processes for the compliance area, that you have established already processes for KYC, or you have processes for your training, you have a good training concept so that you do not roll out trainings for everybody, the same content, but you have it more tailored. This is a higher risk exposure, so you give it a different training than people who have no risk exposure at all, so that not everybody who has no risk exposure is bothered with too many compliance aspects. So you need to tailor it to various risk groups. And on the other side, I think the executive board really, or the boards, need to understand that. They need to support it. And if the compliance function or the management comes up and says, well, I'm a sales manager, I see this issue, I don't know how to react, compliance says, oh, it might be dodgy, then someone needs to support this decision. And that is, I think, where the board needs to come into play and say, yes, you have to figure out whether this red flag is really a red flag. I'm fine with you taking time, not too much time, of course, but to speed up, but you need to take the time to clear the respective red flags. And I think this support is absolutely essential. It comes back to what Arzu said at the very beginning. You need the tone from the top, you need the tone from the middle, and that is also starting at the highest level, supervisory boards and executive boards.
I agree, and I'm gonna make this matter a little bit tangible. Sometimes I'm thinking how board can manage this. I think periodically at the board level, somebody should ask, what are the conflict of interest issues in our company? How conflict of interest risks are managed in our company? Are there any actual conflict of interest in our company? If yes, how they are managed? Conflict of interest in Turkey, at least, maybe 80–90% of the source of the fraud.
Risk. Yeah.
This is extremely important. It's just a suggestion to our audience. Anyway, thank you very much for your contribution. Okay, whenever we talk about fraud or FCPA, UK Bribery Act, of course, the main actor is the third parties, because that's the easiest way to perpetrate fraud. It's pretty difficult to trace. It's easy to hide, conceal. There are many techniques. And most of the time, in many fraud cases, the fraudsters within the company use third parties to funnel the money out of the company for many reasons, for personal reasons, or maybe for the benefit of the company, which is in the scope of failure to prevent fraud. So I want to talk about a little bit about these third-party risks, Arzu. Your experience, especially the BP in Turkey, this is a new offense. Third parties is important in Turkey. Turkey is in the middle of supply chain in the world. So what do you think about this? How it's going to impact this new offense, these risks?
Absolutely, I think it will have a big impact, and because third parties, I think, might be one of the biggest fraud risk exposure for organizations. Why? Because they operate also outside your direct control, but also inside your value chain, right? So when we talk about third parties, if we think about if we think the concept under this new offense, the law uses the term a person associated with the company. So this can include contractors, this can include subcontractors, agents, dealers, and also joint ventures as well. So those people, I think, will be acting or may be acting on your behalf. So they may represent your company in the market. So they may interact with customers, regulators, maybe subcontractors on your behalf. And sometimes I think even they do fraudulent things that benefit you, even if you didn't ask them to do. So this type of scenarios might happen. So maybe we can look at or think of some scenarios how a third party can commit a fraud that somehow benefits the company. So maybe an agent, you can imagine an agent. Agents are the companies that represent us before the government officials or government agencies. So imagine an agent who actually pays bribes, I don't know, to accelerate permits or licenses. So the company, as a company, you may not be directly involved, but it somehow benefits you because of the operating faster. Another example may be a dealer, for example, selling your products, I don't know, using maybe misleading description or specification, and this will boost your sales and revenue. Or you might think of an NOJV maybe failing to disclose any information while applying for a permit. I think in failure to prevent scenarios, regulators, as you mentioned, do not ask whether the company knew it. They ask whether the company should have known and what did the company do to prevent it. I think this is really important. And when we look at the cases or the examples that I just provided, what can the company do is to communicate with your suppliers, monitor your suppliers, share your expectations with your suppliers, and you can identify your suppliers based on risk, right? So you cannot treat all the suppliers as they're all the same. So I think those will be the recommendations that I will share.
Yes, thank you very much. And
I just come in on that. I really like your examples, by the way. I think they're spot on. I think the one misconception which I think is sort of important to correct is in the example of the dealer. A lot of clients that I speak to have this misconception that because the dealer is probably acting for their own benefit above all. I mean, let's start from the position that most fraudsters are wanting to benefit themselves. So in your dealer example, for example, it would be maybe bigger commissions for the dealer, but because a kind of foreseeable side effect of that, a kind of an almost totally predictable side effect of that is greater revenues for the company, that is enough for this offence to bite. It doesn't matter that the dealer actually wanted to benefit themselves more than the company.
Right, that's great contribution. Thank you. And this third-party fraud risk is, I mean, naturally it's a very risky area. But of course, when it comes down to failure to prevent fraud, I think it's more important because if you have a problem in the court, you will be asked to show if you were able to prevent this fraud or not. So you should prove that. So how you are going to prove that? The third-party risk management policy, signed agreement with the third parties about the audit right or other legal issues. But I think this matter goes down to very deep of the company, the business processes of the company. What I'm trying to say, third-party selection process.
Absolutely.
Sorry?
Absolutely. Absolutely, I agree. I think this risk sit across the full cycle of this supply chain process. It starts with, I think, risk-based thinking. So first you need to risk-base your vendors. Then I think you need to start before onboarding your companies. So you need to have a due diligence, not a checkbox exercise, but you need to really try to understand your customers, I don't know, your vendors. So it is also very needed. But also I think contracts or agreements, they also matter because they clearly define the scope, they clearly define the pricing, and they prohibit improper conduct like ABC, AML, and now you can, for example, include fraud and financial crime clauses into your contracts as well. Or maybe you can also have you need to have audit rights, and also you need to access rights as well. So I think another thing about this risk is to have a clear ownership, right? Supply chain fraud risk is not again owned by, it's only compliance. So procurement also owns supplier selection and oversight, and finance actually owns the payment and integrity, and business owns delivery and performance. So I think everybody is involved in the ownership of this risk. And lastly, I think monitoring. Sometimes people sees monitoring and oversight as some policing, but I think it's about curiosity. It's about asking whether something really makes sense. It's knowing the customer and the supplier. And maybe the right question to ask is, if something happens in your organization related to a supplier, who in your organization will personally accountable? Will it be compliance? Will it be procurement? So I think the response to this question gives some clues as well.
And I think also, and if I may jump in, that's
sure.
exactly what I did in my previous roles as well, to do, for instance, trainings together with the procurement or purchasing department, to not be invited only as a guest speaker, because then the mindset is even further into the direction, oh, this is my supplier, my service provider for compliance internally. And you cannot outsource your compliance responsibility to a compliance department. The compliance departments can only provide guidance, can help. So what we did is really setting up with 2 or 3 people from the compliance department, respective workshops to say, okay, please collect respective questions, scenarios, whatever, and have a dialogue and have an integrated training with the purchasing department. And when it comes to fraud, we might also want to think about, sometimes purchasing is different from procurement, because my understanding was procurement also covers logistics sometimes. So we need to focus really on the logistics as well, because there are also simple situations that can be seen over the time as a consistent system or a systematic fraud. Because, for instance, if the logistic manager, in the thinking that it benefits the company, always claims a few pieces as a missing amount from the supplier over the time, and the supplier does not want to make a big fuss out of it and delivers additional pieces. So over a year, 2 years, depending on the supply chain, you might have an amount that is significant as additional pieces that you collected as a false claim of missing parts. And so this is one example where you need to focus your risk assessment on these various teams on the one side, and on the other side, to have joint exercises, joint training sessions, etc., and double check your policies, whether it can fit into the procurement or purchasing policies, instead of having everything separated, but really have an integrated compliance framework.
Absolutely. And I think also this is a great evidence, right? So you can evidence that you trained your suppliers.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I love third-party risk management because it's an endless story and lots of risks. In many investigations we are conducting, we come across this risk, and most of the time I'm really still surprised with the fraud schemes designed by the perpetrators. Very creative, because supply chain is quite complicated. There are many actors, information asymmetry, and lots of processes which are all managed by different actors. So it's really complicated, and sometimes when you look at the procedures, you can see that the procedures are great, and even when you look at the practice, you can see that these procedures are implemented. However, there's another story behind it, because it is designed fraudulently. So very deep relationship may occur in the supply chain. So it's a very difficult area, and it requires lots of time and energy to fight fraud at this process. Okay. Another aspect of the offense, my question to Ellie. Ellie, from an investigations and enforcement perspective, what will regulators, because we haven't talked about a lot about the regulators, look for when assessing whether an organization failed to prevent fraud? And in that context, how should companies think about internal investigations?
Yeah, good question. So I think the first point to just sort of all have in the back of our minds is, ultimately it would be a criminal court that would have to decide in a given case whether a company's procedures were reasonable. So it's kind of difficult, you know, it has to be assessed on a kind of case by case basis. But if we're you know, if we're thinking about how, for example, the Serious Fraud Office would look at a company's procedures, and when I think about it from a kind of future criminal defense perspective, I think a key point is around just making sure that the rationale for decisions taken is documented. So, you know, the guidance recognizes explicitly that a company is never going to be able to identify every type of fraud that could arise in the organization. But there was a shift in the language from adequate procedures under the Bribery Act to reasonable procedures under the Fraud Act under ECTA for this fraud offence, for a reason, because it's recognised that there will be cases that slip through the net. But I think it is really about, for example, Arzu mentioned the importance of turning down deals, not doing business at the expense of compliance. I think it's really important for companies to evidence where they've done that. So don't just look at where you are doing deals and how you are doing deals, but where you are turning down deals because of compliance concerns, whether it's fraud or anything else, frankly, write it down, document it, because ultimately it will be for the company on the balance of probabilities to prove to the authority or ultimately the court that it had reasonable procedures. They might not have worked perfectly, but they were reasonable. There was a documented thought process. And look, we were actually implementing them in practice. We turned down these deals because of these reasons. Yes, we had audit rights in our contracts. That's quite easy to include, but also we exercised them in these 3 cases. Look, and make sure that all of those are evidenceable steps. They could be put in a drawer and you may not have to use them, but if you need to evidence them, you've got that, from 5 years ago, whenever it was. In the internal investigations point, I think is a really good one, because I think they're important for a couple of reasons. One is that investigating suspected fraud within an organization is clearly a critical part of that organization's reasonable procedures, because for one, it's a deterrent effect. If people know that their conduct is going to be investigated in every case, as Arzu said, regardless of seniority, and that there are going to be appropriate sanctions or disciplinary steps taken in appropriate cases. But also, and I think this goes back to a point somebody made at the beginning, because it allows an organization to continually assess its fraud risks. So when doing a risk assessment, one of the things that a company should be looking at is, well, in the past year, where have our internal fraud issues, proven or otherwise, arisen, and what can we do with that data? And then document that those are data points that are feeding into this kind of continually evolving risk assessment. Because, as you said, it's pointless having gold-plated procedures that don't evolve and that are sort of just lying there. They have to be implemented, and one of those steps of implementation is to make sure that your risk assessment is evolving as your business evolves and as the understanding of your fraud risk evolves. The other reason why internal investigations are important, frankly, is to make sure that the company is fully aware of any criminal exposure that it may have as a result of this offence, and the fact that something that its third party or employee might have done could actually create liability for the company, and therefore to get the relevant legal advice and to in some cases make a decision about whether or not the conduct should be self-reported to a relevant authority. But that obviously depends on the facts.
I just wonder, how is the enforcement is going? Just very briefly, so far, since 1st of September 2025.
So there haven't been any cases, but I wouldn't expect there to be. Because,
that's what I wonder.
So first of all, that it only applies to conduct after the 1st of September, right? So first of all, there has to be time for things to happen. Then there has to be time for the Serious Fraud Office to become aware of it, whether that's because of their own intelligence or because companies are self-reporting.
Right.
And then there has to be an investigation, which
Sure.
takes far longer than one would think is possible. So I don't think this is happening like in the next few months, but the Serious Fraud Office has said, in terms publicly, that they are looking for cases.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to keep in mind that it's not only the regulator that might pop up. You might have discussions in front of courts around the world if you are or your employees are involved in any fraudulent activities. So it's more than only this defense or offense, the compliance defense and the failure to prevent fraud offense, to think about fraud. And I think it's rounding or making it the complete picture to have also fraud within your compliance management framework to have this covered.
I fully agree with that. And actually, one point worth making is that, like we saw with the Bribery Act, many counterparties of an organization, so for example, lenders, I think it's quite likely that they will start to require warranties to be given as to anti-fraud compliance and anti-fraud policies and procedures. So it's, even if we only get a smattering of cases, in the next few years that are actually taken to trial or end in a deferred prosecution agreement, it goes much broader than that, and it's about driving compliance rather than just enforcement and changing culture, as you've been talking about.
Yeah. Thank you. So we are approaching the end of the webinar, and last but not least, we're going to talk about very important issue. I know that a large part of our audience today represents Turkish companies, and I'm sure that throughout the webinar, they've been considering how does this affect us. So I'd like to open this part of the discussion with a question focused specifically on that matter. So I'd like to put this question to Ellie and Arzu. Under the failure to prevent fraud offense, what changes for UK companies operating in Turkey? What will they expect from Turkish business partners, and how can Turkish companies reduce their exposure? Shall we start with Arzu and then Ellie, maybe?
Sure. I think we a couple of times mentioned, Ellie also mentioned that this offense does not stop at the UK border. So for UK companies, geography will not be a defense. I mean, what matters, I think, here is who benefited, not where the act occurred. So practically, fraud committed in Turkey by a Turkish employee or maybe a third party, and that benefits a UK company, it can trigger a UK prosecution, reputational damage, it might trigger fines and remediation obligations. And this fundamentally, I think, changes how UK companies view local operations and maybe third-party risks in Turkey from a compliance topic maybe to a criminal liability issue. And Ellie also mentioned about this one as well. So what can UK companies expect from Turkish business partners? I think they will increasingly expect Turkish partners to demonstrate ethical behavior. I think the key expectations will be around clear anti-fraud and ethical controls. As we talk a lot, tone from the top, leadership behavior consistent with the ethical commitments and expectations, a healthy speak-up culture, ability for employees to raise concerns without fear, and training and awareness for the employees, for your third parties, and evidence that people understand actually what fraud looks like in practice. So you might have this by having a risk workshop with the key stakeholders. You might invite, I don't know, finance, procurement, you might involve legal, so that you can have a look at your processes, whether there's any gap or not, so that you can put some mitigations. I think, yeah, those are the things that I would like to say as a starter, Ellie.
Thank you.
I totally agree with all of that. I think the only thing that I would add, and I'd welcome your thoughts on this as well, and Johanna's, my sense is that although organizations could look at their kind of groups and say, well, which organizations are large organizations and therefore in scope, which ones have got UK touch points and therefore are more at risk of committing a UK fraud, and sort of try and carve it out. I think the general preference, and I think it makes a lot of sense, is like under the Bribery Act with anti-corruption procedures, is to take a group level approach. So because so many organizations within any big multinational group will be affected by this offence because it's so broad, it's got broad extraterritorial reach. Actually, I think that even where a company, maybe operating in Turkey and it doesn't itself have a huge amount of UK touch points, as you said, its actions could lead to liability for a UK company sitting in the UK, but also it's going to be affected that the general approach is take the highest standard and roll it out across your group, and then make local additions where necessary.
Well, I fully agree with that. I think I always vote for a group-wide approach for various reasons. The one reason is it's more efficient to have it established as a group level, It's a risk that, as I said, fraud is also a topic. I'm sorry, the kids around us are a bit loud. I cannot stop them. I think the second thought is you have these risks also if it's not UK failure to prevent fraud. As we already said, it's a liability issue. And the third thing is, if you are in an international working company, it's very difficult to explain people that here it's an issue and there it isn't. So I'm also when it comes to other things like corruption, etc., I'm not a big fan of having completely tailored for this country. 50 euros are okay, and in this country 100 euros are okay, because if you move from this country into that country and you have flexible workforce staying in this company for this in this region longer than in the other region, it's confusing people. It's to the detriment of the united tone from the top and from the management. So I'm absolutely in favor of having this global approach, and I think it's not such an additional effort to avoid fraud or to implement fraud in your global compliance framework.
And of course, even if one were to take the approach of carving things up so that you only focus on the companies that are large organizations and have UK touch points, that could change tomorrow as your business evolves. And so there's a risk there that things slip through the net. So yeah, completely agree with that.
I'm always quite pragmatist whenever we are talking about some extraterritorial issues, and if there is a good impact in Turkey, I'm always happy. I hope it's going to impact the Turkish organizations, at least having business with UK companies or connections, because the corruption issue, especially in this jurisdiction, is a great problem, and hopefully it's going to have a good impact. Okay, let's talk about a little bit practical readiness as we are approaching the end of the webinar. Okay, my question will be to Johannes and Arzu. Under this offense, what are the most common gaps you see in fraud prevention? What should organization prioritize over, let's say, a year? And how can these measures be integrated into existing controls? I know the question is quite long, but just your answer. Packed.
Arzu, perhaps you want to
practical readiness, yeah.
Okay, I can go ahead.
Yeah, Arzu.
Okay, I think here the biggest gap are really technical, so they're mostly behavioral. This is my views, by the way. Of course, I'm talking for a mature organization. The most common gaps I see here, first, I think over-reliance on the policies. So organizations most of the time believe that a policy equals controls, but in reality, I think fraud most of the time often happens within the policies, not outside it, through overrides, exception, I don't know, just this one's decisions. And another gap here, weak middle management accountability. So in mature organizations, I think tone from the top exists, but tone in the middle is a little bit inconsistent. So managers under pressure may unintentionally maybe normalize the risky behavior to achieve some targets. And another gap might be, I think, blind trust in the third parties. So many organizations, I think, assess third party risk at the onboarding, but they stop monitoring it afterwards, where actually fraud risk typically, I think, emerges. Another one might be about, this might be not a big maybe gap, but poor use of data. So the data exists, I think, within the company. So you have the expense reports, you have the, I don't know, concerns metrics, you have every data. But sometimes I think we forget to analyze those data for fraud indicators. And lastly, I think it's common for all the ethics and compliance risks. It's a big gap if it exists, fear of speaking up and the retaliation, I think. Because I think such cases, including fraud, I don't know, each ENC case comes up with someone speaking up. I think those are the gaps that I can see in fraud prevention.
And absolutely, I fully agree with that. Also, when I think the data analysis that you mentioned, I think it's a very important point because from what I suspect or expect in the future will be that a regulator in 3, 4, 5 years at the latest comes back in all regards, not only fraud, but also in other regards and say, well, you had all the data. You had even AI as an option to analyze data, but you never used that. So you completely ignored the means that you have already that you can use. And that will be to the detriment of the companies that the regulators will say you could have done better. So I think that's a risk. And with regard to fraud per se, I think from my experience, fraud was always seen as a threat against the company from the outside in. And I like to use this term outside in and inside out because I think that it's really more now from the inside out that this is a new perspective that needs to come into the compliance framework, that the people try to commit fraudulent activities in the best interest of the company. But at the end, it's fraud inside out that is now in focus as well. So there is a shift or an additional perspective that comes to the normal compliance work.
From criminal liability perspective, Ellie, would you like to add anything? I mean, what companies should prioritize within, let's say, a year in order to prevent any problem in case of court case?
Was that to me?
Yes, to you, yeah. What could be practical readiness for organizations to prevent any risks, significant risks because of this offense?
So I mean, obviously, the sort of complete answer is to kind of do the whole process, roll everything out across the global organization. But for organizations that are just coming to this now, I would say, really the cornerstone of everything that follows is the risk assessment. And so to get that done, and then maybe it's a question of going through that and picking, I don't know, the top 10 risks, and identifying, what the controls are that exist for those, where the gaps are, and plugging those, and then rolling out that same methodology on a kind of, going through the remaining risks, but in the knowledge that the key ones have been addressed as a priority. And again, and I come back to this all the time, documenting every step, documenting every decision. There may be areas of the business where actually a particular risk is identified that is so low that it's disproportionate to kind of make any changes to the existing controls. That may be a very reasonable decision, but document the reasons for it.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And even what I came across in previous roles was that sometimes others, like wholesalers, complained about that the manufacturer, for instance, did not follow the requests from the from the wholesalers to commit at the end something that was illegal, and they published it and said, well, due to this strong compliance of this company, we cannot do this and that. And all these evidences, I think what Ellie already mentioned, should come into a folder that you say, oh, there was a news article here and there that is praising the compliance here, or a good behavior in that regard, so that you have really a good story to illustrate that there is a compliance culture in place and not only 1 or 3 policies in addition.
Thank you. My last question to all panelists, looking ahead the enforcement of the offense, considering. So is this offense simply another compliance issue or maybe burden, or is it really governance opportunity that will reshape expectations around corporate integrity? Maybe when you are sharing your thoughts, you can also add your last words before closing. So let's start with Ellie.
So look, I think there's no doubt that it is a burden in the sense of resource and cost. But I think it's also an opportunity for, better governance and compliance. And we saw the same thing with the Bribery Act. This isn't really only about enforcement risk, although of course that's that's the stick. But the carrot is having, a more compliant business that lenders and other counterparties want to deal with. And it's really part of a trend, I think, of the government, certainly of the UK, but I think it's been replicated in certain ways in other jurisdictions, putting the onus more on the private sector to prevent and detect economic crime. And I don't think we've seen the last of it. So I think this is a real opportunity for companies to get ahead of the curve.
Yeah, thank you. Johannes?
I fully agree with what Ali said, and I think it's very positive at the end that you have this compliance defense at all, because in various other regimes over the last years, you've seen the opposite, and it's now a positive development, now positive in various regards in other areas as well, that compliance itself can help to reduce your exposure. And that you have these compliance defenses, from my perspective, a perfect trigger or incentive for the companies to go into this compliance culture, and to have some. Also, if you only think about financial figures, at the end you can put it into a benefit for the company if you live up to that, and it's that's from my perspective a positive thing.
Thank you. Arzu?
I think both Johannes and Ellie covered everything that I like to say, but maybe I can reply this side. I think the response, whether this is a compliance burden or a governance opportunity, I think it depends on how organizations choose to respond, right? If organizations choose to treat this offense as a compliance burden, they will think that adding more policies, they create, I don't know, more approvals, increasing documentation, and this approach may maybe satisfy the internal checks, but it doesn't fully prevent fraud, as we talked at the beginning of this call, I think. However, I think organizations see this as a governance opportunity, the response looks very different. It becomes a reason to, I don't know, accountability for your leadership. It strengthens your oversight for your third parties. It might, I don't know, make fraud prevention part of how business is governed, not just the control. So I think this is really important. During the session, we talk about the leadership tone from the top. Tone from the top, speak up, concerns. We talk about the surveys that can show psychological safety. So I think it's really, I would suggest to look at this as a governance opportunity.
Thank you very much. What I understand is that this new offense will try to move compliance away from formalistic procedures and toward demonstrable behavior. I like these words: demonstrable behavior, demonstrable governance, and demonstrable culture. I don't know how companies will do that. This is difficult, of course, to demonstrate behavior, governance, and culture. That's something really we should work together. And ultimately, the aim is to make fraud prevention a board-level strategic responsibility. I'm really interested in this part as well. And make fraud prevention a board-level strategic responsibility. This is quite missing in Turkey. This is my experience. And driving, of course, long-term integrity and trust in the business environment. So as we close this webinar, I'd like to leave you with one question to think about. If fraud happened tomorrow, could your organization confidently show a court that you took reasonable steps to prevent it, not just that you had policies on paper? Will you have any evidence to put in the court that you've taken your action properly? So with that, we are coming to the end of today's webinar. Thank you to our panelists for insights. Arzu, Ellie, Johannes, many thanks. And also to our audience, of course, for joining us today, especially those who stayed until the very end of this webinar. So you are my favorite audience. But at the moment, I think almost 50. Just 5 minutes ago, almost 70 audience were there. So it's, I think, great number. Of course, after thanking two panelists and audience, I think big thanks to the secretariats of both associations, because without them we wouldn't make this event happen. Many thanks to TEİD and BCCT. And
Thank you
thanks.
very much. It was a great webinar. Thank you. I also learned a lot. It was very interesting. And thank you all for your time. And like you said,
But we couldn't get any question. That's my issue. I just checked a couple of times, but
yeah, I was gonna say, I think
explained everything very good. So maybe
exactly that shows there are
that's
no
something I'm gonna believe.
unclear points. Okay, thank you very much for everyone joining us as well. Hope to see you at another webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Bye.